Hey friends, advice for new DMs can sometimes feel like trying to drink from a fire hose. That's why today I've got 7 actionable tips that can help you to improve your game from the very beginning. My name is Timothy, though some people do call me Tim, and I'm a professional dungeon master running over 300 games of Dungeons & Dragons every year. These 7 things that you need to know are big topics that I've broken down into a more bite-sized package. But if you want to know more, I go into more depth on these topics in other videos, so feel free to subscribe. For now, let's dig in, kick rulebook overwhelm to the curb, and talk practical DMing. The first tip revolves around knowing versus remembering. Nobody expects their dungeon master to be a perfect rules encyclopedia wandering around with absolutely every piece of knowledge about their lore, their material, and the rules available in perfect recall at any particular moment in time, always. Or at least if there is such a player, that player is wrong to think so. We are fallible creatures, otherwise they would replace us with robots. It's important for DMs to know the rules and to know their material the best that they're capable of doing so, but we sometimes place just a little bit too high a bar on exactly how much that needs to be known, when in reality, the difference is that we need to be able to remember what happens at the table, so that when we do create something that might be coloring outside the lines just a little bit, we have a record of it to refer to when we're preparing for the rest of our campaign. It's great to spend time in learning the rules of your game and the story that you're looking to tell, but it is more important that you make a devoted practice to writing down what has happened in your game for later reference when it's going to be necessary. When things go outside, make sure that you have something that you can refer back to so that you can confidently move forward in the story. There are definitely other pieces of information that are important to keep track of in our record-keeping process, but I'll touch on that in a later tip. For now, let's talk about tip number 2, which is knowing when to roll. There are a lot of memes out there that are essentially just diatribes against how ridiculous Dungeons & Dragons is, in that somebody can conceivably accomplish any task absolutely imaginable simply by rolling a natural 20 on the dice. In reality, you are not supposed to allow your players to make a dice roll on absolutely any ridiculous idea that pops into their brains. You decide whether or not this is something that can fail or can succeed, and if it doesn't fall into the middle range between those two options, then it is not something that you should bother asking for a dice roll for. Things that can't fail don't need a dice roll in order to succeed, and things that can't succeed don't need a dice roll in order to fail. It's an empowering thing to realize that when you are having these crazy ideas pitched to you at the table, that you don't have to accept them if they don't fit with your vision of the game. Now, that being said, it's still a great and important thing to learn how to yes and our players and to allow them to attempt things that are within some bound of reasonable. But just as you would not expect somebody to walk in and say to a person in a bank, "Can you please give me all the money in the vault?" and have them say, "Yeah, sure, that sounds super reasonable," simply because you were particularly charming, going to the magic item shop and asking for all the items to be given to you at a loss to the shopkeeper or for free is not something that you should bother allowing your bard to make a check on, even if they can't roll below a 10. Thank you, College of Eloquence. It's important when you are looking at these kinds of things that you have some kind of an idea of your players' abilities and the range of scores that they're able to get, but again, we'll touch on recording player abilities a little bit later. Point number 3 I call the ask twice, write once method. Unlike the measure twice, cut once that my granddad taught me when we were working on carpentry projects when I was a little kid, this is not a proactive thing to be done ahead of time in order to make sure you don't mess up, but rather a reactive rule to remember in your brain. If you have to ask a player for the information that you require modifier in order to adjudicate something twice, then it's probably time that you had a written record of it on your side of the DM screen. This can apply to anything from hit points and armor class to skill ability modifiers, which can be really useful for you to have on your side of the screen for the occasional roll that might not need to be rolled by your players. Naturally, this loops back to the knowledge of your material, but the cart does not need to come before the horse in this situation. As you need to ask for them, learn that that is the kind of thing that's worth writing down for you at your table, which might be different from what I need to write down for me at mine. Sometimes this could extend out into page reference numbers for specific materials, or books that specific items come from, or number of charges a day, number of abilities expended. You get the idea. Almost anything could be on the list at your table. It just depends on what kind of material you need regularly. This ties into the next 3 tips, which are largely based around transparency. On the topic of transparency, if you could take a moment to like this video and perhaps share it with another DM that could use it to find content to improve their game, it would really help out the channel and allow us to help as many people as possible. Thanks. I'd really appreciate it. Tip number 4 revolves less around what you're rolling and more about where, and it's about letting them see. While we're going to talk about the value that's added in engagement with players and their rolls, this tip is talking about where you're supposed to roll your dice. There are some pretty big benefits to the increase of trust and the increase of tension that come from your dice being rolled out in the open. Sometimes that seems counterintuitive because you might think that hiding a dice and keeping the information hidden would rise tension, and there are occasions when, honestly, that's frankly true. But a lot of the time, watching that many-sided polyhedron scrolling across the table, even if it's a virtual one, is a great way to increase that anticipation moments before the big reveal when the math rolls out and everybody finally discovers what exactly is happening. By rolling out in the open, you increase the trust that your players have for you because they know that almost everything that happens at your table happens where they can see it. That isn't to say that there won't be the occasional time when it's important to hide the dice, and so here's the rule of thumb. If your players' characters would be able to see success or failure just as easily at the end of a specific action, roll that dice out in the open. If, however, a failure or a success would be obscured from them, then you should roll that dice behind the screen where they don't see. And since you're going to be rolling most of your rolls out in the open, that sets us up right into our next tip, which is to let them roll their own dice. Aside from the fact that players can be pretty touchy about who is rolling their dice and the troubles that come from automating too much of that in the electronic space that we have nowadays on virtual tabletops, the simple fact of the matter is that rolling dice is fun, and it's an important way for us to allow our players to increase their feeling of agency and their investment in the outcome, and to reduce the feeling of helplessness. There's nothing quite so frustrating as being told this happens to you and never having a chance to roll any kind of dice to impact the outcome, even though realistically speaking you don't have any real control over what the dice is going to throw. This has an additional added benefit of separating blame by one step from you, the DM, when the dice gods decide to pick on somebody. This ties right back into the previous commentary about when it is okay for you to take charge of the dice and why it's a topic that requires such careful negotiation. Meanwhile, when your players are rolling the dice, it can help if they know what they're shooting for. It's my advice that under most circumstances, you openly share difficulty and armor classes with your players. No matter how well we feel like we are describing a scene, there's always going to be a bit of a cognitive dissonance between us and our players. The math portions of Dungeons & Dragons are there primarily to create a fun and awesome game, but also to facilitate the distance between our thoughts and descriptions in a way that allows people to understand the situation around them. If I was to tell you to climb a sheer cliff, you might have a different opinion of what your character's ability to climb that cliff is compared to what I think it is. By telling your players what the difficulty class is, your players can make an informed decision as they do a little backwards math and can work out how their character should feel about the proposed situation. Likewise, as attack rolls are just going to be gamed out and swiftly discovered, after the first attack, it should be readily apparent to any seasoned swords person how hard it is to bring harm to a target. And incidentally to that, it also means that when those dice are being rolled by our players or rolled openly by us, we're able to have an increase in tension as we know what kind of number needs to rock up on the dice in order to have the outcome that we're looking for or dreading. The transparency in this and the prior two tips is all about having our players have a sense of agency, keeping them engaged, and keeping them informed of the situation that their character finds themselves in. Because the final tip that I have for you today is to realize that your players don't know. Because when it comes to transparency, no matter how clear that you feel that you have been in narrating a circumstance, in describing a scene, in showing with fancy maps or 3D printed terrain, your players are not you, and they do not know what is inside your head. It is important that you err on their side when it comes to any misunderstandings that might be had, and that you feel free to be heavy-handed in your foreshadowing and in the telegraphing of what might happen at your table and what is going on. Sometimes I hear DMs talking about how their surprise got ruined because of a lucky dice check or a great guess by a player. They feel like maybe they messed up by giving too much information, and so the cool special encounter that they had worked out fell apart, never happened, or was summarily trumped by the players because of the knowledge that they had had. My argument against this is, thank goodness, that sounds awesome. And I bet that those players were not walking away from that game saying we had absolutely no fun by trouncing that super boss monster or jumping right through that puzzle because so-and-so had the awesome idea that the answer might be this. Instead, they're probably walking away with that guy proverbially up on their shoulders doing the victory lap around your living room. Frankly, most of your surprises are probably going to be more fun if your players ruin them. And on top of that, if they're not more fun because they're ruined, then hopefully they were at least quick, and keep in mind, well, you can always get them next time. And as a bonus tip, be a fan of your players. Enjoy their successes, and you will enjoy your job as their dungeon master a whole lot more. As someone running 8 games a week, I can attest to that. Maybe you've got some tips for how to run a smooth game that I missed. If so, drop them in the comments below. I'll be diving deeper into pretty much all of these, so if you want to dive deeper and drink from the fire hose, then don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and happy adventuring.